In 1879, the Smithsonian established the Bureau of American Ethnology, a division specifically tasked with studying the indigenous peoples and archaeological sites of the Americas. The Bureau operated for nearly a century, producing thousands of reports, surveys, and publications that form the foundation of American archaeology. The Bureau's founding director was John Wesley Powell, explorer, geologist, and the man who had led the first documented expedition through the Grand Canyon. Powell was brilliant, ambitious, and ideologically committed to a specific narrative that the indigenous peoples of the Americas were primitive, that their cultures had developed in isolation, and that the continent had no history prior to their arrival. This narrative served multiple purposes. Politically, it justified the ongoing dispossession of native lands. If indigenous peoples were primitive and their cultures were young, then European settlement was not conquest, but improvement. Academically, it established a framework within which all American archaeological findings had to be interpreted. Any artifact, any site, any discovery that suggested an older, more advanced, or more complex history was, by definition, anomalous. And anomalies were the Bureau's specialty. It collected them, cataloged them, and filed them away. The Bureau's reports contain fascinating contradictions. Field researchers, the men and women who actually dug in the sites and handled the artifacts, frequently described findings that challenged the official framework. Mound sites that were too complex, too precisely engineered, too vast to be attributed to the populations that the Bureau insisted had built them. Artifacts made of materials not locally available, using techniques not consistent with the assigned culture and time period. Inscriptions in scripts that bore no relationship to any known indigenous language. The field reports describe these findings. The published summaries omit them. The artifacts were sent to the Smithsonian. The sites were filled in. The researchers moved on to the next project, their anomalous findings buried in appendices that no one was encouraged to read. Powell's successor, William Henry Holmes, was even more aggressive in enforcing the narrative. Holmes actively campaigned against any researcher who proposed that human habitation of the Americas was older or more complex than the Bureau's official timeline allowed. He discredited colleagues. He suppressed findings. He used the Bureau's institutional authority to end careers. The Bureau of American Ethnology was not a research organization. It was a narrative enforcement mechanism using the authority of the Smithsonian, the most trusted scientific institution in the United States, to determine not what was true, but what was permitted. The mounds. The mound complexes of the American Midwest and Southeast are the most visible evidence of what was erased. There were, once hundreds of thousands of them, earthen structures ranging from small burial mounds to massive geometric complexes covering hundreds of acres. Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, was larger than London in 1250 AD. Poverty Point in Louisiana, dating to roughly 1700 BC, is a complex of concentric earthen ridges and mounds that required an estimated 750,000 cubic yards of earth to construct. Moved without wheeled vehicles, without draft animals, by a civilization that the official narrative classifies as semi-nomadic hunter-gatherers. The mounds were the most obvious evidence that the Americas had a monumental past, a civilization or civilizations capable of organized labor on a massive scale, with knowledge of geometry, astronomy, and engineering that did not fit the story of primitive peoples waiting for European enlightenment. In the 19th century, the mounds were the subject of intense public interest. Researchers, amateur archaeologists, and curiosity seekers excavated hundreds of sites, finding artifacts that ranged from the expected to the inexplicable. Copper tools of extraordinary refinement, textiles woven with techniques not known in the pre-Columbian Americas, tablets inscribed with symbols that bore no relationship to known indigenous writing systems, and repeatedly, skeletal remains of unusual size, buried in elaborate tombs with grave goods that suggested a stratified, complex society. The Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology was tasked with resolving the mound builder controversy, the public debate over who had built the mounds. The Bureau's conclusion, published in 1894 by Cyrus Thomas, was definitive. The mounds were built by the ancestors of the current indigenous peoples. There was no separate, earlier civilization. No mystery. No anomaly. This conclusion required ignoring a substantial body of evidence. Thomas's report acknowledged that certain artifacts and features were difficult to explain within his framework, but he dismissed them as trade goods, misidentifications, or modern intrusions. The anomalous material was cataloged, sent to the Smithsonian, and shelved. The controversy was declared settled. The mounds were attributed to known peoples. The question was closed. Researchers who continued to investigate alternative hypotheses found their funding withdrawn and their access to sites revoked. And the mounds themselves, the physical evidence, began to disappear. Not through erosion or neglect, but through active destruction. Mounds were leveled for farmland, for road construction, for urban development. Sites that had survived thousands of years were bulldozed in decades. The Smithsonian did not intervene. The Bureau did not object. The most extensive body of archaeological evidence on the North American continent was systematically reduced to a fraction of its original extent, and the institution charged with its preservation watched it happen. The Kennewick Problem. In 1996, a human skeleton was discovered on the banks of the Columbia River near Kennewick, Washington. Initial analysis determined that the remains were approximately 9,000 years old, and that the skull's morphology was not consistent with any modern Native American population. The features were described by the examining anthropologist as most closely resembling Polynesian or Southeast Asian populations. This was a problem. The official narrative held that the Americas were populated by a single migration from Siberia across the Bering Land Bridge. A 9,000-year-old skeleton that didn't look Siberian, that looked, in fact, like it belonged to a different population entirely, threatened the foundation. The Army Corps of Engineers, which controlled the site, attempted to hand the remains to local Native American tribes for reburial under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. A group of scientists sued to prevent this, arguing that the remains were too old and too morphologically distinct to be claimed by any modern tribal group. The legal battle lasted nearly a decade. During that time, the Corps of Engineers dumped hundreds of tons of fill dirt and vegetation on the discovery site, making further excavation impossible. The Smithsonian was involved in the analysis and the dispute. When the remains were finally studied, after years of legal delays, the Iowa findings were published in a framework that minimized their significance. Kennewick Man was reclassified as Native American based on DNA analysis, and the morphological anomalies were explained as the result of normal variation within ancient populations. The remains were repatriated and reburied in 2017. They can never be studied again. A 9,000-year-old skeleton that didn't match the accepted narrative was returned to the earth permanently after a decade-long institutional effort to prevent its study. The site was destroyed. The evidence was buried, literally, physically buried, and the story moved on. The Missing Collections. In 2004, the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History conducted an internal audit of its collections. The results were not widely publicized. The audit found that significant portions of the institution's early archaeological and anthropological collections could not be located. Catalog entries referenced specimens that were not on their designated shelves. Accession records described artifacts that had no corresponding physical objects. Storage areas that should have contained specific collections were empty or contained different material than the records indicated. The Smithsonian attributed the discrepancies to decades of imperfect record keeping, institutional reorganizations, and the normal challenges of managing a collection of 55 million objects. This explanation was accepted. No further investigation was conducted. But the pattern of what was missing was not random. The gaps were concentrated in the earliest collections. The material gathered in the 19th century by the Bureau of Ethnology and its predecessors, the material from the mound surveys, the skeletal collections from the anomalous sites, the artifacts that field researchers had flagged as inconsistent with the prevailing narrative, the routine material, the pottery shards, the common tools, the unremarkable specimens that confirmed the standard timeline was all present and accounted for. What was missing was the material that didn't fit. Selective incompetence is indistinguishable from deliberate destruction, unless you notice that the incompetence always affects the same category of evidence. Losing 1,000 artifacts is carelessness. Losing 1,000 artifacts that all contradict the same narrative is something else. The present tense. The Smithsonian today is the largest museum and research complex in the world. It operates 19 museums, 9 research centers, and a zoo. Its annual budget exceeds $1 billion. It employs over 6,000 people. It is the most trusted cultural institution in the United States. It also controls what Americans are permitted to know about their past. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a structural observation. The Smithsonian determines which artifacts are displayed and which are stored, which research is funded and which is not, which narratives are presented to the 25 million people who visit its museums each year, and which narratives are confined to storage facilities in Suitland, Maryland. The institution does not need to actively suppress information. It merely needs to decide what is important and what is not, what deserves a display case and what deserves a shelf in a warehouse. The artifacts it chooses not to display are not destroyed. They are simply made invisible. They exist in a limbo of institutional silence, present in the collection but absent from the public's awareness, technically accessible but practically unreachable. And the invisible artifacts, the ones in the warehouse, the ones with incomplete records, the ones on shelves that don't match their catalog entries, the ones that simply cannot be found, tell a story that the visible collection does not. They tell the story of a continent with a history far older, far more complex, and far more unsettling than the one presented in the galleries upstairs. A history of civilizations that built on a monumental scale, that worked in materials and techniques that do not fit the approved timeline, that left behind remains that suggest a population physically different from the one the narrative allows. The Smithsonian has not destroyed this history. It has done something more effective. It has collected it, cataloged it, and locked it in a warehouse, preserving it perfectly while ensuring that no one ever sees it. The building in Suitland is climate controlled. The artifacts are safe. They will last for centuries. And they will sit there, in the dark, behind locked doors, in a building that most Americans don't know exists, holding answers to questions that the institution has spent 178 years ensuring no one thinks to ask. This is a work of fiction and speculative storytelling. The Smithsonian Institution, the Bureau of American Ethnology, Kennewick Man, and the mound complexes of North America are real historical subjects. The Smithsonian does hold approximately 155 million objects, most of which are in storage, a common practice at major museums worldwide. However, the suggestion that the Smithsonian systematically suppresses or destroys evidence of a hidden ancient civilization is not supported by mainstream archaeological or historical evidence. The institution's collections management challenges are well documented and consistent with the logistical realities of operating the world's largest museum complex. Magdalena River Basin, Colombia. Present day, 3:47 a.m. A farmer named Hernando Ruiz wakes to a sound he has heard too many times before, a deep, rumbling grunt coming from his cassava field. He knows what is making that sound. He knows he should stay inside. He knows that what is out there has killed before, but his crop is being destroyed. His livelihood is being eaten. He grabs a flashlight and walks toward the sound. The beam of light catches movement. Gray skin, massive body, small ears twitching, eyes reflecting red in the darkness. A hippopotamus. It weighs approximately 3,000 pounds. It can run faster than any human. Its jaws can crush a watermelon like a grape. And it is standing in the middle of Hernando's field, eating his cassava plants with complete indifference to his presence. Hernando shouts. He waves his arms. The hippo looks at him for a moment, then returns to eating. There is nothing he can do. This scene repeats every night across hundreds of square miles of Colombian countryside. Farmers lose crops. Fishermen abandon rivers. Children are warned never to swim in certain waters. Because of hippos, Pablo Escobar's hippos. In 1981, Pablo Escobar illegally imported 4 hippopotamuses to his private zoo at Hacienda Nápoles. 1 male, 3 females, exotic pets for a man who could afford anything. When Pablo died in 1993, those 4 hippos were left behind. The government did not know what to do with them. The cost of relocating them was enormous, so they did nothing. For 31 years, those 4 hippos have been breeding, and breeding, and breeding. Today, there are approximately 170 hippopotamuses living wild in Colombia. They are the largest invasive species in history. They are destroying ecosystems, threatening human lives, and spreading across the country at a rate that scientists cannot control. And they are Pablo Escobar's strangest, most enduring legacy. This is the story of the cocaine hippos. To understand how hippopotamuses came to infest the Colombian countryside, you must understand Hacienda Nápoles and the man who built it. By 1978, Pablo Escobar had accumulated enough wealth to fulfill any fantasy. He chose to build a private kingdom. Hacienda Nápoles covered approximately 7,700 acres of land in the Magdalena Medio region of Colombia. Pablo constructed a mansion, guest houses, a private airport, a bull ring, a go-kart track, and a sculpture garden featuring full-sized concrete dinosaurs. But the centerpiece was the zoo. Pablo wanted exotic animals, not just 1 or 2. He wanted a collection that would rival any zoo in the world. He wanted to walk through his own property and see creatures from every continent. He began importing animals illegally. Giraffes from Africa, elephants from Asia, kangaroos from Australia, rhinoceroses, zebras, ostriches, exotic birds of every description. The hippopotamuses arrived in 1981. They came from a zoo in the United States, smuggled into Colombia through the same networks that moved cocaine in the opposite direction. 1 male, 3 females, young animals, healthy, adaptable. Pablo housed them in an artificial lake on the Hacienda Nápoles property. They had ample space, warm water, and unlimited food provided by Pablo's staff. The hippos thrived. By the time Pablo died in December 1993, the original 4 had become a herd of approximately 8. The females had been breeding successfully, and the Colombian climate had proven surprisingly hospitable to animals native to sub-Saharan Africa. When the government seized Hacienda Nápoles after Pablo's death, they faced an impossible situation. The exotic animals needed to be dealt with. Some were relocated to Colombian zoos. Some were transferred to international facilities. Some died from neglect as the property's staff disbanded and funding disappeared. But the hippos posed a unique problem. Adult hippopotamuses weigh between 3,000 and 4,000 pounds. They are among the most dangerous animals on Earth, responsible for more human deaths in Africa than any other large animal. They cannot be easily sedated, transported, or contained. The cost of relocating 8 hippos was estimated at several $100,000. The Colombian government, dealing with the aftermath of Pablo's reign of terror, had other priorities. So they left the hippos where they were. It was the beginning of an ecological catastrophe.